Good evening. I'm Jim Sciutto. Anderson is off tonight. The National Security Council confirms that lines of communications with North Korea are back open again, and even the Trump-Kim Jong-un summit now seems at least back in play.
Mr. President, the summit's still off. We're going to see what happens. We're talking to them now. It was a very nice statement they put out. We'll see what happens.
So, just one day after axing the June 12th meeting in Singapore in a letter mixing nuclear bluster and call me maybe, the president today reversed course.
No, we'll see what happens. It could even be the 12th. We're talking to them now. They very much want to do it. We'd like to do it. We're going to see what happens.
We'd like to do it, he says. And again, late today, we learned that conversations between Washington and Pyongyang are back underway. So, what's Korean for whiplash? We asked one of our guests tonight, Sumi Terry, who I'll apologize in advance for what I know is going to be a brutal pronunciation, but she says it is called Dol Pyun. And from Little Rocket Man to future peace partner to jilted ex to we'll see what happens, it's been Dol Pyun all the way, even line by line in the president's Dear Kim letter yesterday. Quote, you talk about nuclear capabilities, but he writes, ours are so massive and powerful that I pray to God they will never have to be used. And later, in that same letter, if you change your mind having to do with this most important summit, please do not hesitate to call me or write. And there is more whiplash. CNN's Barbara Starr reports that the Pentagon is on alert for some kind of North Korean nuclear or missile testing. At the same time, Defense Secretary Mattis, he's signaling optimism.
We're not changing anything right now. It's steady as she goes. The diplomats are in the lead and in charge.
So serious questions remain about just what those diplomats are being asked to accomplish now, what the president really wants to get out of this summit, and the role, for good or ill, that China might play. Also, perhaps most importantly, how each side understands the very notion of denuclearization, which is, after all, the central issue on all this, and what the unpredictable and intractable Kim might do next. That is forever unclear, which may also apply, you might say, to President Trump. He has, remember, touted the value of unpredictability and the nearly boundless virtues of his own deal-making.
We need somebody with great energy, with great passion, with great deal-making skills.
I'm going to make the great deals.
I am going to make great deals for our country.
I mean, what I do is I do deals. I deal.
I negotiate by creating leverage so I can extract a good deal for the United States, for the people.
I make deals. I negotiate.
Everybody wants me to negotiate. That's what I'm known as a negotiator.
I'm so anxious to negotiate. Nobody can out-negotiate these deals.
I will make a great deal and lots of great deals for the American people. I am a deal maker, and that's what the country needs, is a deal maker.
We don't make great deals anymore, but we will once I become president.
I'm a closer. We're going to close. We're going to start winning so much, just like the video. We're going to win and win and win.
Well, we'll see. More now on all this from CNN's Pamela Brown. She joins us now from the White House. So, Pamela, do we know what changed? Yesterday, the president said it was inappropriate to continue with this summit. He even made what appeared to be a nuclear threat. Now, 24 hours later, optimism from the White House. Do we know what changed?
Well, I can tell you what changed here, Jim, is the line of communication has reopened with the North Koreans, according to officials. One official says that the North Koreans hadn't been sending the right signals. That has changed ever since the president sent that letter yesterday morning to Kim Jong-un saying that the summit was off the table, boasting about the military prowess, but also inviting him to call or write. And then there was that conciliatory statement from a senior North Korean official last night praising the president for having the confidence to do the summit and showing an eagerness to continue to hold talks, saying that the North Koreans are prepared to sit face to face anywhere, anyhow, anytime. And so that certainly added to this optimism from the White House. You saw that from the president today. Clearly, he liked this statement, saying that it was warm, productive, it was a nice statement, and really leaving that door open that not only could the summit happen, but it could still happen on June 12th within the 24-hour window of him canceling this. So it's clear this is what the president wants. I spoke to one senior administration official who said that the White House is more optimistic than expected today in the wake of that statement from North Korea and the fact that the communications have reopened. So we'll have to wait and see what happens, Jim.
One thing you can often read is what level of planning the White House is doing. Is an advanced team still planning on going to Singapore as was planned before the summit to get the ball rolling for that June 12th date?
That is the big question, because that would certainly be telling, Jim. Sarah Sanders, the press secretary, basically said, we'll see. She certainly didn't say that they weren't going to go anymore. They were supposed to leave this evening, Jim, to go to Singapore to get ready and meet with the North Koreans. The White House has yet to definitively say whether they're still going to go just as a contingency for the June 12th summit. As you'll recall, officials had said that last time they were there just recently, they were snubbed by the North Koreans. So it certainly could be telling if they're going to proceed as planned to go to Singapore to prepare for the summit on June 12th. We'll have to wait and see on that front as well, Jim.
You can be forgiven for being confused by all this. Pam Brown at the White House, thanks very much. Well, when we last left, CNN's Will Ripley had literally just broken the news on the North Koreans about President Trump calling off the summit. He'd just come back from the destruction earlier that same day of a nuclear test site by North Koreans. Safe to say the North Koreans were surprised by the president's letter. Will remains in North Korea, and he joins us now from Wonsan. So, Will Ripley, you are in North Korea. What are North Korean officials saying about the summit? Do they believe there's hope it still comes off?
I think they're cautiously optimistic, Jim. I mean, there was a lot of shock on the train ride back from the Punggye-ri nuclear test site when we learned that President Trump had canceled the summit. And yet the next morning, instead of the angry response that we were expecting from North Korea, especially after their heated rhetoric, the insult hurled at Vice President Pence, calling him a political dummy after he compared North Korea to Libya, of course, a country that gave up its nuclear weapons only to have its dictatorship overthrown a few years later. The North Koreans now, it does seem as if they think that they can work with the United States, and that's why you saw that statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a much more conciliatory tone. They offered praise for President Trump. They said he was brave for taking steps that no other U.S. president has taken before, and they said they're willing to sit down and talk with the United States at any time. So we know that North Korean diplomats have now reopened lines of communication with the United States that had been closed. They're now returning phone calls and whatnot, trying to see if they can work out and make something happen to make this summit in Singapore occur on June 12th, as was originally scheduled. We'll see.
So what happens now? What are the next steps? Because they can agree to have the summit, but is there any indication that North Korea is willing to move towards the key issue here, which is actual denuclearization by the U.S. definition, which is to say no nukes whatsoever?
Well, I can tell you over many visits to this country over the last several years, on every trip, North Korean officials told me they would never give up their nuclear weapons. It's written into their constitution that they're a nuclear power. And yet what we've seen in recent months has been an abrupt U-turn, and that is largely at the direction of the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. He has now said that he's willing to discuss denuclearization with the United States in exchange for the end of what North Korea considers a hostile policy by the U.S. towards North Korea. They don't want to see as many U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula. Eventually, they'd like to see them all withdrawn. They're not happy about the American nuclear umbrella that protects South Korea and Japan. And so they want the United States to take steps along with the North Koreans, which means that they don't think of denuclearization as a process that would take a matter of months, like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has suggested, but a longer-term process, something that China also shares that view, that it's not going to be something that happens overnight.
A lot of distance between the two sides. Will Ripley in North Korea, thanks very much. Perspective now from two people with long experience on the Korean Peninsula and in pulling off summits. Former CIA North Korea analyst Sue Mi Terry. She is Korea chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Also with us, CNN diplomatic and military affairs analyst, retired Navy Rear Admiral John Kirby. Dr. Terry, if I could begin with you. Does this drama, this back and forth in the span of 24 hours, the friendly note, our nuclear arsenal's bigger than yours, the please call me now, everything's warm and productive, does that credibly lay the groundwork for a credible summit between the U.S. president and the North Korean leader?
Well, this whiplash, and you said Dorbian, I'm sure caught North Koreans by surprise. They're completely floored by this, because certainly no U.S. president, they expect no U.S. president would act this way. But North Koreans never wanted to cancel this meeting. Their signals were not understood correctly. The two previous statements that they were making was a protest against Libyan deal and all this rhetoric coming out of Washington about Libya, because Libya is a nightmare scenario for North Koreans. But they never wanted to cancel the meeting. Kim Jong-un actually really wants this meeting. So I do think this meeting is going to happen now that Trump wants it and Kim Jong-un wants it. And their last statement that came out 7 hours after Trump canceling the meeting, I've never seen such a statement before. It was very conciliatory for North Korean standards, personally praising Trump. So I do think there's an incentive for these two leaders to meet, and I think it's going to happen.
Admiral Kirby, I can practically hear the president's supporters, perhaps the president himself, saying, this is Trump the deal maker. He threatens to walk away from the table. He brings them back to the table. In your experience, you dealt it with the State Department. You were a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy and the Pentagon. Do those kinds of tactics apply in a sensitive international discussion about nuclear weapons?
I don't know if those tactics will necessarily work well once the summit happens and they're sitting down across from one another. There's nothing more difficult or complicated or nuanced than arms control discussions. You really got to know your detail. But in getting ready for a summit, for a meeting, particularly in that part of the world, yes, I think this tactic could work. I think it actually has worked. I mean, he pulled a Kim on Kim. If you might remember, in the run-up to the Olympics, Kim was threatening, "Hey, I'm not going to go. I'm not getting all the infrastructure support and the resources he wanted." He threatened to pull out, and of course, they made accommodations, and he came. I was involved with sensitive discussions for a senior Pentagon official to go visit China many years ago. We weren't getting the kind of schedule that we wanted, so we pulled the rug out from under the trip. Said we're not going to come. All of a sudden, things that we needed to get on the schedule started getting on the schedule, and the trip happened. So it could work in terms of getting the summit in place. But in terms of a successful summit, that's a whole different matter.
Dr. Terry, that's really the issue here, because you could make the summit happen, I imagine, if both leaders want it. That's what you need. But on the issues that they're going to negotiate here, the key one being, will North Korea denuclearize by the definition that the U.S. has of denuclearizing, no nukes, particularly for a regime that views nuclear weapons as really its means of survival. Do you see the two sides getting closer on that clear issue, that key issue?
Well, that's a key question. As Will talked about, denuclearization for North Korea means something entirely different. They always meant denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula if the regime security is guaranteed and if U.S. hostile policy ends, which has all kinds of implications for U.S. alliance relationship with South Korea, our troop presence in South Korea, our extended nuclear umbrella we have over South Korea. So we have a very big gap here of what we think of denuclearization and what North Korea thinks of as denuclearization. So I don't know how we're going to bridge that gap. And to get to complete verification of North Korean nuclear weapons, I really don't know how we're going to bridge this gap. But it's up to the two leaders. I will find out soon once they sit down.
Sure, and better for them to sit down than be threatening to shoot at each other. Admiral Kirby, one senior administration official told CNN today, June 12th, quote, is in 10 minutes. So if it does happen, it certainly doesn't give diplomats a lot of time to work out, if not agreement on those key issues, at least a path to agreement on those key issues.
Yeah, look, summit preparation for any head of state meeting is a huge undertaking and takes a lot of detailed planning, even in the best of circumstances, Jim, when the two heads of state are friendly and we know the meeting is going to happen. It's really difficult right now. And I would argue that June 12th was 10 minutes away back when Trump agreed to actually have the meeting, because it was on a fast track back then. Now, I'm heartened to hear from Pam's reporting that the back channels and communications are back in place and there's talking. I suspect that there wasn't that much of a gap in terms of time of planning, given the little kerfluffle over the last day. So I suspect they're going to be able to get back on track pretty quickly. But still, it's a lot to get done in a very short period of time.
Sumi Terry, Admiral Kirby, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, next we're learning more about the chief White House defense lawyer's presence at a meeting that many believe he had no business whatsoever getting near. We're also learning that the White House's initial story about it might not have been, listen to this, might not have been true. Later, the man hit by a lava bomb. We're learning now that he is more than just a survivor. He is being called a hero, and we're going to show you why.
Some of that surprised me.
Welcome back. We are learning more about the national security briefings on a source in the Russia investigation that drew such controversy yesterday because of two surprise guests. White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and Emmett Flood, the president's hand-picked defense lawyer handling That's right, the Russia investigation and the president's involvement. Justice Department officials briefing lawmakers on what were sensitive details of that case. And at least at the outset, the main lawyer for a main subject of that probe was in that room. At first, the White House explained it this way. Neither Chief Kelly nor Flood actually attended the meetings, but did make brief remarks before the meeting started to relay the president's desire for as much openness as possible under the law. By yesterday afternoon, a Republican congressional aide was telling the lead's Jake Tapper that their presence was, quote, the craziest stuff I ever heard. Only the staffer did not use the word stuff. By late last night, a White House official was telling CNN's Jim Acosta that Flood and Kelly's presence likely did not help with concerns over the meetings being politicized. And by today, a congressional source familiar with what happened was telling Jim Acosta again that Kelly and Floyd did not leave until some members spoke up and said that it was inappropriate for them to be there inside that room. We should note that a separate administration source says it was always the plan for them to leave after Kelly's remarks. Plenty to discuss now with our two next guests. They are CNN Chief Legal Analyst Jeffrey Toobin and his old Harvard Law School professor, now Professor Emeritus Alan Dershowitz. He is author of Trumped Up: How Criminalization of Political Differences Endangers Democracy. Professor Dershowitz, why is it appropriate for Emmett Flood, he's the lawyer hired specifically to represent this president in the Russia probe, for him to be at this meeting yesterday?
Well, if I'm a defense lawyer, I try to go to any meeting I'm not kicked out of. If they want to talk to me, I'm there to listen. It's their job to decide whether it's appropriate or not. They told him it wasn't appropriate. He left. But the job of the defense lawyer is to find out anything he can in whatever way he can, as long as it's legal and ethical, and the other side is prepared to let him listen. So I don't blame Flood for doing it. If there's anyone to blame, it's the people who let him into the meeting.
Jeffrey Toobin, Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, told CNN that he assumes that Flood was at this meeting because the president wanted him to be there. Of course, a defense lawyer will do whatever he can get away with, I imagine. But does this give the appearance that the White House was trying to abuse their authority to gain leverage in this case?
Well, I don't know about abuse their authority, but I mean, I think Alan is right. Mm-hmm. This whole enterprise, this whole fake controversy about a spy is about one thing. It's about discrediting the Mueller investigation and potentially leading to his firing. It has nothing to do with civil liberties. It has nothing to do with fairness. It is a political attack on Robert Mueller that Flood was trying to gather information, as Giuliani acknowledged. He was trying to gather information in a way that has traditionally not been allowed. He was thrown out. But, I mean, that's the moment we're in now. This was a political, and it remains a political matter above all.
Professor Dershowitz, do you disagree?
Well, it's right out of the playbook that the Clinton people used to discredit Ken Starr. And, of course, Flood was part of the Clinton defense team. Even I played a small role in consulting with Clinton's lawyers during that event. And obviously, the Clinton approach was twofold. One, to try to use legal means to prevent what happened from happening, and second, to discredit Starr, and if it ever went to impeachment, to make it into a blue-red issue. And I think the people on the other side here and the Trump administration are trying to do the same thing.
Yeah,
so
but wait, there's one.
They're trying to discredit in case discrediting becomes necessary.
There's one important difference. Yeah, there's one important difference. You're right that they tried to, fight back by legal means. You're right that they tried to make it a political controversy. What the Clinton people did not do is invent lies out of whole cloth. There is nothing comparable to the president, President Trump saying that there was a spy and that this is worse than Watergate. I mean, the level of lies that Donald Trump has used in this effort to attack Mueller is a quantum difference from what the Clinton people did. And I think it's important to preserve that distinction.
Let's start with the spy. Now, spy is a characterization, but all civil libertarians should be concerned anytime the FBI puts an informer into a political event, a campaign, an anti-war movement, the Martin Luther King campaign. We all complained to civil libertarians when the government put informers in.
Let's just remind, if we can, Professor Dershowitz, I cover intelligence and national security, so just
sure.
For the sake of our viewers, there was no person in the campaign. I've spoken to multiple intelligence officials about this. This was a confidential source who went to members of the campaign who had bragged about, in effect, George Papadopoulos among them, the Russians offering dirt on Hillary Clinton to them. So an informant had a conversation with them. And then I could, listen, I'm not a lawyer, but I understand the civil libertarian concerns. Jeffrey, to your knowledge, is that a fair equation that the professor is making here between past examples of the FBI, putting spies inside anti-war movements, et cetera?
Right. I mean, it's Alan. It's wonderful to talk about, the abuses of power of Martin Luther King and the anti-war movement. They have absolutely nothing to do with what happened here. They tried to get Martin Luther King to kill himself. The anti-war movement. Let me finish. And here, there were a couple of conversations between George Papadopoulos and this confidential informer and Carter Page, and that's it. So, I mean, I appreciate your effort to try to change the subject, but to call this, as the president has, worse than Watergate is preposterous, and it's our job to call it out.
No, I agree with you. This isn't anywhere close to Watergate. It is not the way the president characterized it, but it's also not nothing. But I have no problem with at least inquiring. I agree with you. I think Trump overstates it when he says this is worse than Watergate and it's the worst scandal ever. And that's what presidents and presidential campaigns and people who are being investigated do.
No, that's not, Alan. I mean, you're normalizing Trump's behavior, and it's not the same as what other presidents do.
I'm criticizing his behavior. What I'm saying is I, as a civil libertarian, and other civil libertarians have a right to be concerned every time an informer gets near a presidential campaign. We want to know why it happened.
Jeff, fair to have that public inquiry into that? At least ask the question?
Absolutely not. There is a tradition and a rule within the Justice Department that they do not disclose the witnesses or investigative techniques about pending investigations. This is an active case. And what the Justice, and what Rod Rosenstein has done to try to protect his job, and in a way to try to protect Mueller's job, is to bend the rules and give the House Republicans and give the president access to information that they have absolutely no right to. And at this stage in the investigation, absolutely not. This is well, I know you don't agree, but the answer, but this is an example of how they're using their political power to get things they're not entitled to.
Guys, we're going to have to leave it there. It's a fantastic discussion between professor and student.
Happy holiday to everybody, please. Have a good holiday.
Professor Dershowitz, Jeff Toobin, thanks very much. And one other quick note on all this. David Axelrod's got a great guest on Axe Files this weekend who certainly has plenty to say on the Russia affair, as well as the president's attack campaign targeting professionals investigating him. Fired Acting Attorney General Sally Yates is going to be his guest, and here's a preview.
What do you make of the president's demand of the Justice Department that they essentially investigate the investigation of that involves his campaign and perhaps him?
Yeah, well, this has really taken the assault on the rule of law to a new level. Really from the beginning of this presidency, President Trump has not observed the time-honored norm that's been in place, at least since Watergate, that there should be a real division between the Department of Justice and the White House. And here, it's even a step beyond a dangerous point, because it's not just directing a criminal investigation or to stop one of anyone. It directly relates to his campaign. That's truly unprecedented.
You can see the entire conversation on the Axe Files. That is Saturday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on CNN. And coming up, new CNN reporting tonight about a Russian oligarch who met with President Trump's personal attorney, Michael Cohen, this less than 2 weeks before the inauguration and just days after the president-elect was briefed on Russian interference in the election. When we continue, details of that meeting as well as its implications.
Sally Yates joins David Axelrod for the Axe Files tomorrow night at 7.
Welcome back. Sources tell CNN that a Russian oligarch whose recent as well as sanctioned by the United States showed up with Michael Cohen 11 days before the inauguration. That meeting was just 3 days after. Then FBI Director James Comey also came to Trump Tower to brief President-elect Trump on Russian interference in the election. The oligarch, Victor Vekselberg, was accompanied by his cousin, Andrew Intrater, whose company, Columbus Nova, then paid Cohen $580,000 for a consulting contract that began, coincidentally or not, in January 2017. CNN's Shimon Prokupecz, Kara Scannell, and Jeremy Herb, they share the reporting on this story. Shimon joins me now. Shimon, so yet another meeting in Trump Tower with Russians tied to the government in many cases. What are you learning about why this meeting took place?
Well, Jim, certainly folks who are familiar with this meeting say this was about U.S. And Russia relations and ways perhaps to improve it. What's not clear is why Victor Vekselberg would think meeting with Michael Cohen would somehow help those relations, since really Michael Cohen at the time, besides having access to the president, didn't really have any say, as far as we know, in the transition or in any policy that perhaps the president was going to institute. What's interesting about this meeting is that it lasted about 30 minutes. We're told it was a quick sort of meeting. They came in, they spoke with Michael Cohen, they went up to his office, and then they left. And also, just days before this meeting, Andrew Intrater, the cousin of this oligarch, donated money to Trump's inauguration. And as you reported, it was sometime after this meeting that his company, this Andrew Intrater's company, wound up hiring Michael Cohen for some work.
So, as you mentioned, Michael Cohen, he didn't have a formal role in the Trump administration, was not part of the transition team. Despite that, are the people who took part in this meeting, these Russians, are they cooperating in the investigation?
Well, certainly we know that both have been questioned. In fact, Victor Vekselberg was the man who was, when he arrived in New York, came off his flight, his private plane. Mm-hmm. He was met by FBI agents. When they questioned him, they had subpoenas and search warrants for him. They took his electronics. So there was some questioning of him. And I've been told that he hasn't been cooperating with the FBI. Obviously, he's been sanctioned. So the sanction came after the meeting with the FBI, with the Robert Mueller's team. Andrew Intrater, he's been also questioned by the FBI, by folks from the special counsel team, and he's answered some of those questions. People close to him say that he's been cooperative. But overall, I think the focus here really, what's important is that you yet have another Russian, another person, Victor Vekselberg specifically, who with close ties to Vladimir Putin, who is at Trump Tower, that Robert Mueller and his team is now scrutinizing.
Shimon Prokupecz, thanks very much. Joining me now with more are Jennifer Rogers. She's a former federal prosecutor, now at Columbia Law School, as well as former White House ethics czar for President Obama, Norm Eisen. Ambassador Eisen, as we look at this story, really another meeting with a Russian with connections to the Kremlin took place in Trump Tower during the transition in this case. Is this purely an optics problem, or do you see legal, ethical issues here?
Jim, we don't know yet what the answers to the questions are, but there are profound legal and ethical and national security questions that surround this extraordinary pattern of over 70 contacts with those in and around Trump and his transition and his campaign, and now another one in Trump Tower with Victor Vekselberg. We know that an American company associated with Vekselberg, Columbus Nova, paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to Michael Cohen. So there could be serious issues, Foreign Agent Registration Act issues, possible quid pro quos. One thing we can be confident of, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York are on the case. They're looking into it, so we will get some answers, but very troubling.
And I feel compelled to mention that whenever one of these meetings come up, we should remind people that when there were first reports of meetings between Trump aides during the transition, during the campaign, they were denied that there were any meetings whatsoever. Of course, that's been belied by the facts. Now, Jen, on the point of payments, both Columbus Nova and Mr. Vekselberg, they deny that any payments came to Cohen directly from Vekselberg. If that's true, does that limit his exposure? Because I imagine there are other ways that payments could be funneled, as it were, to him. From a legal standpoint, though, is that a protection, a buffer there?
Well, we'll see. I mean, you know, originally when the news came out about Columbus Nova, they said that Vekselberg had absolutely nothing to do with that relationship with Cohen. Now we learn about this meeting, which was apparently just a few days before the deal was struck. So there's still a lot to look into about whether Vekselberg was involved and to what extent. But it is a potential problem for them, for sure.
Jen, something that's come up frequently in these cases is something known as the Foreign Agents Registration Act. It's known as FARA. Basically, if you work for a foreign entity, you have to, volunteer that, register that. So Cohen hired by Columbus Nova in this case, not by Vekselberg or the Russian government. I mean, how does that relate to the FARA laws?
Well, in order to be guilty of a FARA violation, it would have to be shown that Cohen actually is acting as a foreign agent. So if he really is just working with the Columbus Nova, which is an American company, you wouldn't get there. But if it actually is him lobbying on behalf of Vekselberg, and by the way, it has to be doing something with the administration, lobbying or something like that. It can't just be him supposedly sharing his expertise.
Or giving advice, expertise, etc. He would have to say, let me represent your case directly to the administration or something.
And if he's lobbying on behalf of a foreign agent without registering, then that is a potentially criminal offense of the FARA Act.
Understood. Ambassador Eisen, so Cohen not working for the transition at the time and has not actually worked for the U.S. government, though, of course, he has a very close relationship with the sitting president of the United States. Does that at all insulate the administration, at least, from this situation ethically and legally?
Well, it depends on what contacts he had with the administration, what access he had to the president or those around him, what deals he did or did not strike with them, whether there were any quid pro quos. It'll depend on the evidence, Jim. But, there is some reason to ask hard questions. Why did this Vekselberg-linked company, Vekselberg's entity is their largest client of this American company, Columbus Nova, suddenly, in the presidential transition, agree to $1 million contract with Michael Cohen? Was his expertise suddenly more valuable because of, as they say, investment advice? I don't think so. So it's fair to ask these hard questions.
Ambassador Eisen, Jen Rogers, thanks very much for taking the time tonight. It has been another hectic week in Washington. I suppose what other kind of week can there be in Washington? Just ahead, New York Times White House correspondent Maggie Haberman on North Korea, confidential sources, and the Trump White House.